You are drifting somewhere between waking and sleeping right now, and that is exactly where we want you. Welcome back to Bedtime Survivalist, the place where history's hardest lives become tonight's softest bedtime story. If this is your first night with us, get comfortable, because we are about to spend the next few hours moving slowly, quietly, through the wilderness of the 19th-century American frontier, following the footsteps of the men who disappeared into it and somehow found a way to live. If you have been here before, you already know the routine. Dim the lights. Let the room go a little cooler than usual. Pull the blanket up around your shoulders the way a trapper might pull a hide around his in the last hour before a mountain fire burns down to coals. And if you would like to support these long, slow nights of ours, there is a membership waiting for you, along with hours of ad-free listening whenever sleep refuses to come easily. For now, just settle in. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do except listen. Have you ever wondered what it would take to survive completely alone, hundreds of miles from the nearest town, with nothing but a rifle, a knife, and whatever knowledge you manage to carry in your own head? Could you build a shelter that would keep you alive through a winter that buries the world in snow for months at a time? Would you know how to find water that would not make you sick, or food that would not poison you, in a landscape that offered no maps, no signs, and no second chances? Could you fall asleep each night, without the comfort of walls, without the sound of another human voice for weeks on end, trusting only the fire in front of you and the rifle across your knees? Tonight, we are going to find out gently, quietly, the way a story should be told at this hour, because somewhere in the folds of the Rocky Mountains, in the decades before photographs and before railroads, a small number of men chose exactly that life. They were called mountain men, and for a handful of years in American history, they were among the most self-sufficient human beings the continent had ever produced. Picture the year as somewhere in the 1820s or 1830s, the high point of what became known as the fur trade era. You have just left behind the last outpost of civilization, a cluster of log buildings and muddy streets that already feels like a memory before you have gone a single mile. Ahead of you lies country that very few people from the eastern towns and cities have ever seen with their own eyes. Mountains without names on any map you have ever held. Rivers that have never felt the weight of a keelboat. You carry a rifle, a good knife, a hatchet, a few traps slung across your shoulder, and whatever small store of powder, lead, and flour you could manage to pack onto your horse or your own back. That is the whole of your world now. Everything else, every comfort you once took for granted, exists only in memory. The reasons a man walked into that kind of life were never quite as simple as the old stories make them sound. Some went for money, plain and straightforward, because a good season trapping beaver could bring in more than a year of ordinary labor back east, and the demand for beaver pelts in the fashionable hat-making trade of Europe seemed, for a time, to have no limit. Others went because the growing towns of the eastern seaboard had begun to feel like a cage, all fences and ledgers and other people's expectations, and the wilderness offered something no town could, the chance to answer to no one but yourself. Still, others simply could not say exactly why they went. There was a restlessness in certain men of that era, a pull toward the edge of the known world, and once they felt it, no amount of comfort or safety could talk them out of it. Whatever the reason, the moment a man turned his back on the last settlement and rode west into unmapped country, something in him had to change, and change quickly, or he would not last the season. That change began with the understanding that no one was coming to help. Back east, even a poor man had neighbours, a constable, a doctor of some kind, a church bell that told him the hour. Out here, a broken leg could be a death sentence. A wrong turn in a canyon could mean days lost with no trail to follow home. A single mistake with a rifle or a knife could not be undone by anyone but the man who made it. This was the deepest and most important lesson of frontier life, more important than any single skill, and it had nothing to do with tools or techniques. It was simply this: you were now entirely responsible for your own survival every hour of every day, for as long as you chose to stay. Men who could not make peace with that fact turned back within weeks. The ones who stayed learned to think differently, to move through the world with a constant, quiet awareness of everything around them, because that awareness was the only insurance policy available. The company men, those who signed on with outfits like the American Fur Company or the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, at least traveled in larger parties, guided by experienced leaders who had made the journey before. There was a rough safety in numbers, more hands to build a shelter, more eyes to watch for danger, more rifles if trouble came. But even within a company brigade, a trapper often worked his own trap line alone, days or weeks removed from the rest of the group, checking sets in creeks and beaver ponds far from camp. The so-called free trappers went further still, answering to no company at all, selling their furs to whichever outfit offered the best price at the yearly rendezvous, living an existence so independent that some of them might go an entire season seeing only a handful of other human beings. Names like Jedediah Smith, who walked farther into unmapped territory than almost any man of his generation, or Jim Bridger, who came to know the geography of the Rockies as intimately as a man knows the rooms of his own house, or John Coulter, who is said to have wandered alone through the geothermal wonders of what would later become Yellowstone and told stories so strange that few believed him at first. All of these men shared this same defining trait. They had made their peace with solitude, and in doing so had unlocked a kind of freedom that almost no one else in 19th-century America ever knew. The gear a man carried into this life was deliberately minimal, because everything had to be carried, and every extra pound was a pound that slowed him down or wore out his horse. A good rifle was the single most important possession he owned, more valuable than gold, because it was food, defense, and often his only reliable tool for solving whatever problem the wilderness put in front of him. A sturdy knife came next, used for skinning, for building, for eating, for 100 small tasks that never stopped needing doing. A hatchet or small axe made shelter and firewood possible. Beyond that, a trapper carried steel traps for beaver, a fire-making kit, some dried food to get him through the first days before he could rely on hunting, and precious little else. There were no spare changes of clothes waiting in a cabin somewhere. What a man wore on his back when he rode west was very often what he wore, patched and repatched, for months at a time. And once each year, if all had gone well, there was the rendezvous, the great gathering where trappers from every scattered corner of the mountains converged on a single valley to trade their furs, resupply for the coming season, and remind themselves briefly of what human company felt like. We will return to that gathering later in our journey together because it deserves its own quiet hour of attention. For now, understand only this: the rendezvous was the one bridge back to civilization, and for the rest of the year, a mountain man lived entirely without it. The moment he rode away from that valley alone or with a small party back into the peaks and the timber, he was once again on his own, and the very first problem waiting for him, the problem that would decide whether he survived even a single night, was the oldest problem there is. Where, in all this wilderness, was he going to sleep? The first night alone in true wilderness has a way of teaching a man more than any amount of preparation ever could. The sun drops behind the ridgeline far sooner than it seems like it should, and the temperature falls with it, sometimes by 20 or 30 degrees within the span of an hour. There is no cabin waiting, no barn, no lean-to already built by someone who came before. There is only the land itself, and the land, if you know how to read it, is quietly offering you everything you need. Learning to read that offer, learning to see a hillside not as scenery, but as a shelter, waiting to be recognized, was the very first skill every mountain man had to master. Long before he mastered trapping or hunting or anything else, a man could go hungry for a day or two and survive it. A man who spent a single unprotected night in an exposed place during a mountain storm might not survive until morning. The first thing an experienced frontiersman did upon choosing a campsite was simple observation, done slowly and without hurry, because hurry led to poor choices. He looked at the wind, feeling which direction it came from and which direction it was likely to shift as the temperature dropped with the nightfall. He looked at the ground, avoiding low hollows where cold air would pool overnight and where water would gather if rain came. He looked up at the slope above him, watching for any sign of loose rock or dead-standing timber that might come down in a storm. And he looked for what the land was already offering for free, an overhanging shelf of rock that could block wind and precipitation from at least one direction, a dense stand of evergreen trees whose branches could cut the worst of a wind that would otherwise carry the warmth straight out of a man's body, a natural depression against a hillside that could be improved rather than built from nothing. The best campsite was very rarely the most comfortable-looking spot at first glance. It was the spot that solved the most problems at once: wind, water, visibility and firewood, all within a short walk of one another. Rock overhangs were treasured when they could be found, because they provided an instant roof requiring no labor at all, only the work of making the space beneath them livable. A floor of dry brush or hide to insulate a sleeping body from the cold stone below, a small windbreak of stacked branches or stone across the open side. But such overhangs were not always available, and so the mountain man became, by necessity, a builder as well as a wanderer. The lean-to was his most common construction, simple enough to erect in under an hour with nothing more than a hatchet, some cordage or strips of hide, and whatever timber stood nearby. A ridgepole set between two trees or propped against a standing trunk. Smaller branches leaned against it at an angle, and then layer upon layer of brush, bark, and boughs woven across that frame until it shed rain and wind rather than letting them pass through. The open side of the lean-to always faced away from the prevailing wind and toward the fire, so that the structure itself would catch and reflect the fire's heat back onto the sleeper rather than letting it escape uselessly into the dark. For those who had learned from the peoples who had lived in this country for countless generations before any trapper arrived, more elaborate shelters were also within reach. Something resembling a wickiup, a domed frame of bent saplings covered in bark, brush or hide, could be built to last through an entire season if a trapper intended to stay in one place for a stretch of weeks. This was slower work, requiring more time and more material, but it rewarded that investment with a shelter that held heat far better than any simple lean-to, one with walls on every side and only a small opening for entry and for smoke to escape. Learning this kind of construction, along with countless other survival skills, was one of the many debts the mountain men owed to native peoples who had spent centuries perfecting exactly how to live well in this same unforgiving country. The trappers who survived longest and thrived most were, almost without exception, the ones humble enough to learn from those who already knew the land far better than any newcomer ever could. As the seasons turned, so did the entire approach to shelter. Summer camp might be little more than an open lean-to near a stream, chosen for easy access to water and grazing for the horses, quick to build and quick to abandon when it was time to move on and check another stretch of trap line. But as autumn light grew shorter and the first hard frosts began creeping down from the peaks, a wise trapper started thinking seriously about where he would spend the deep winter months, because winter shelter was an entirely different undertaking. Winter camps were built low, tucked against south-facing slopes where the weak winter sun could still offer some warmth during the day. Sheltered from the prevailing wind and always close to both water and standing timber, because a man who had to travel far for either in the deep snow of a mountain January was a man burning precious energy he could not afford to lose. Some trappers built low dugouts partially sunk into a hillside and banked with earth and snow for insulation, structures that from a distance might have been mistaken for nothing more than a rise in the ground, yet inside held enough warmth to keep a man alive through temperatures that would otherwise kill him within hours. Whatever the season, whatever the structure, insulation was the quiet, unglamorous secret behind every successful shelter. A roof that kept out rain meant little if the cold could still creep up from the bare earth beneath a sleeping body, drawing away body heat all through the night. Hides were spread thickly across the ground before a man ever lay down. Dry leaves, pine boughs, and dead grass were piled beneath those hides for additional loft, the same principle a modern camper would recognize in a sleeping pad, though no trapper of that era would have used the word. Packed earth, brush, and snow itself, surprisingly, were pressed into the walls and roof of more permanent shelters, because snow, for all its cold, traps still air within it extraordinarily well, and still air is warm air, or at least warmer than the wind that would otherwise tear straight through an open structure. By the time a mountain man had built and slept in his first dozen shelters, the whole process had become instinct rather than calculation. He could ride into an unfamiliar valley as the light was failing, and within minutes his eyes would already be sorting the landscape into the same handful of categories: wind, water, wood, and stone, weighing them against each other almost without conscious thought, until his feet carried him toward the spot that answered all four questions at once. It was a kind of fluency, the same fluency a modern reader has with written language, letters and words no longer requiring effort to decode, but simply understood at a glance. And once that shelter stood, once the wind was blocked and the ground insulated, and the last of the daylight was fading into that deep blue of a mountain evening, there remained only one more task standing between the trapper and a night of relative safety and comfort. He needed fire. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a camp the moment the first flame catches, a shift in the whole feeling of a place that anyone who has ever built a fire in true wilderness will recognize immediately. A moment before, The darkness pressing in from every direction feels vast and faintly threatening, full of sounds that cannot quite be identified. A moment after that first small flame takes hold and begins to grow, the world shrinks back down to something manageable, a small circle of orange light and warmth that a man can call his own for the night. For a mountain man, fire was never a luxury. It was survival in its most literal and immediate form, and the ability to produce it reliably, in any weather, with damp wood and cold hands and failing light, was one of the most valuable skills a frontiersman could possess. The tools for making fire in this era were simple but demanded real skill to use well. Flint and steel formed the standard method, a small piece of high-carbon steel struck sharply against a shard of flint or similar hard stone to throw off tiny sparks. Those sparks alone were not enough to start a fire. They needed somewhere to land and catch. That is where char cloth came in, a piece of cotton or linen fabric that had been slowly burned in a sealed container until it was reduced to a black, carbonized material that would catch even the faintest spark and hold a small glowing ember rather than bursting into open flame. A trapper carried a small tin or pouch of this precious material at all times, protected carefully from moisture, because a wet piece of char cloth on a cold, rainy evening could mean the difference between a warm night and a dangerously cold one. Striking that spark into the char cloth was only the beginning. The glowing ember, no larger than a pinhead, then had to be transferred with steady hands into a small nest of the finest, driest tinder a man could find, usually shredded inner bark, dry grass, or fine wood shavings, cupped gently in the palms and blown upon with slow, patient breaths until the ember spread and finally burst into flame. This moment, more than almost any other in a day's routine, demanded patience above all else. Blow too hard, too soon, and the ember would scatter into darkness, gone, and the whole slow process would have to begin again with cold fingers and dwindling light. Experienced mountain men developed a rhythm to this work, an unhurried, almost meditative sequence of small movements repeated so many times over the years that their hands seemed to know the steps before their minds did. Finding the right materials for that fire before a single spark was ever struck was itself a skill built from long observation of the natural world. Not every piece of wood would serve every purpose. The driest, most resinous wood, often found in the dead lower branches of pine trees, branches that had died and dried while still attached to the living tree, and so had been protected from ground moisture, made for excellent kindling and would catch even in damp conditions. Birch bark, when it could be found, was treasured for its natural oils, which allowed it to burn readily even when everything around it was soaked through from rain or melting snow. Standing dead wood was always preferred over fallen timber lying on the wet ground, because a dead tree still upright had spent months or years drying in the open air, while a fallen log had likely been soaking up moisture from the earth beneath it. A trapper learned to walk through a forest with his eyes constantly cataloguing these small differences, filing away the location of a good dead pine or a stand of birch for later use, the way a modern person might remember which grocery store has the best produce. Once a fire was properly established, the work did not end there. A fire left unattended through a cold mountain night would burn down to nothing within a few hours, leaving a man to wake shivering in the coldest part of the night, usually just before dawn. Managing a fire through the long hours of darkness was its own quiet discipline. choosing wood that would burn slow and steady rather than fast and bright, banking the coals with ash or earth to preserve heat through the deepest hours, and often waking at intervals through the night, specifically to feed the flames before drifting back into sleep. Some trappers built their fires against a large rock or a fallen log positioned behind the flames, which would absorb heat during the evening and radiate it back out slowly through the night, extending the warmth of even a modest fire for hours longer than it would otherwise last. But fire was never only about warmth, important as that was. It was protection as well, a barrier that most wild animals instinctively avoided, and a mountain man sleeping in bear or wolf country understood that a well-tended fire through the night was as much a defense as the rifle laid across his blankets. Fire was cooking, transforming raw meat into something safe and nourishing, and rendering edible plants that would otherwise be tough or even harmful if eaten uncooked. Fire was a signal, a way to be found by allies, or, just as often, a risk to be carefully managed when a trapper had reason to believe hostile eyes might be watching from a distant ridge, which meant that sometimes, on the more dangerous stretches of a journey, the wisest choice was no fire at all, only a cold camp and the quiet discomfort of a night spent trusting darkness itself as cover. And fire, in the end, was morale, something that mattered more than the old accounts always give it credit for. A man who had walked 20 miles through freezing rain, who had seen no other human face in 3 weeks, who lay down each night uncertain of what tomorrow would bring, found in the simple act of building and tending a fire something that went beyond the physical. It was a small, steady act of control in a world that offered very little of it, a ritual repeated every single evening that reminded him, in its own quiet way, that he was still capable, still resourceful, still very much alive. As the fire settled into its steady evening rhythm and the shelter stood firm against the coming night, a trapper's attention would naturally turn to the next quiet necessity of frontier life, one that shaped every decision about where to camp in the first place. Because a man could build the finest shelter in the mountains and tend the most perfectly managed fire, and none of it would matter for very long if he had not also solved the oldest and most constant problem of all, the problem of finding water he could trust. Water, more than almost anything else in the wilderness, dictated the entire rhythm of a mountain man's life. Every choice of campsite, every day's route of travel, every decision about where to set a trap line circled back eventually to this single question: where was the nearest reliable source, and could it be trusted? In the mountains, at least, nature was often generous. Snowmelt fed countless streams and creeks tumbling down from the high peaks, and a trapper moving through this country rarely had to travel far before crossing running water of some kind. The difficulty lay not so much in finding water as in finding water that was genuinely safe, and in knowing how to read a landscape well enough to locate the best of it, even in seasons or regions where it grew scarce. Moving water was almost always preferred over standing water, a piece of wisdom born from generations of hard experience, even before anyone fully understood the reasons behind it. A stream tumbling over rocks, aerating itself with every small waterfall and rapid, was far less likely to harbour the kind of stagnant growth that could sicken a man than a still pond baking quietly in the summer sun. Springs, where water emerged fresh from the ground itself, were prized above nearly every other source, often running cold and clear even in the deepest heat of summer, filtered naturally through layers of rock and soil on its long journey to the surface. An experienced trapper learned to recognize the telltale signs of a spring from a distance, a patch of unusually green vegetation clinging to an otherwise dry hillside, a slight depression in the ground where the earth stayed damp, even when everything around it had dried out, the particular flat, silvery gleam of water pooling quietly rather than the moving glint of a stream. Reading the wider landscape for water became second nature over time. Valleys naturally tended to carry more water than ridgelines, since gravity pulled every drop of rain and melting snow steadily downhill. Certain trees and plants, cottonwoods especially, announced the presence of water long before a thirsty man could see it himself, their distinctive shape and pale bark, visible from a considerable distance across open country, a reliable signpost that had guided travellers, both native and newly arrived, for generations before any formal map of the region existed. Game trails, too, told their own quiet story, since animals needed water just as badly as any man did, and a well-worn path, cutting consistently in one direction across otherwise trackless country, very often led sooner or later to a stream, a spring, or a pool. Even once water was found, a wise trapper did not drink without at least some measure of caution, though the tools available to him for judging safety were limited by the standards of any later century. There was, as yet, no scientific understanding of the microscopic organisms that could turn a clear, cold, inviting stream into a source of serious illness. What existed instead was a body of practical, hard-won observation, passed down and refined across years in the wilderness. Water taken from higher up a watershed, closer to its source and further from any low ground where animals might gather or die, was generally considered safer than water drawn from lower, more heavily used stretches of the same stream. Water that was cloudy, that carried a strange odour, or that sat unnaturally still and covered in a filmy surface, was avoided whenever any alternative could be found nearby, and boiling, whenever time and fuel allowed for it, provided a rough but genuinely effective form of protection, even though the trappers of this era could not have explained precisely why it worked. They simply knew, through repeated experience passed down from those who came before, that water treated this way was less likely to make a man sick, and in a life where illness far from any doctor could easily become fatal, that kind of hard-earned practical knowledge was worth more than any formal explanation. The placement of a camp itself reflected this constant, careful negotiation with water. Too close to a stream, and a sudden storm somewhere upriver, invisible and unknown to the man camped below, could send a wall of water crashing through camp in the middle of the night, with almost no warning at all, a real and sometimes fatal danger in narrow mountain canyons where water had nowhere to go but straight through whatever lay in its path. Too far from water and every task of daily living, drinking, cooking, washing wounds, watering a horse became a long and exhausting chore, eating away at hours that could otherwise be spent hunting, trapping, or simply resting a tired body. The ideal camp sat close enough to water for convenience, but elevated just enough above it to remain safe from all but the most extreme and unlikely flooding, a balance that experienced trappers learned to judge almost instinctively after enough seasons in the mountains, reading the shape of a valley and the height of old flood debris caught in nearby brush, the way a sailor might read the sky before a storm. Winter brought its own particular set of water challenges, ones that a man from the settled towns back east would rarely have had reason to consider. Streams that ran clear and easy through the warmer months could freeze over entirely, locking away water beneath a thick crust of ice that had to be broken through with an axe or a heavy stone before it could be reached at all. A trapper, wintering in one place, often chose his camp specifically with this problem in mind, seeking out stretches of moving water least likely to freeze solid, sections where a current still ran fast and turbulent enough beneath the surface to keep at least a portion of the stream open even through the coldest weeks of January and February. Where all water sources had frozen over entirely, snow itself became the fallback. Though even here a careful trapper knew never to eat snow directly without first melting it, since the simple act of doing so would burn through calories and lower the body's core temperature, a dangerous trade in the deep cold of a mountain winter when every ounce of stored body heat mattered. Beyond mere survival, water shaped the entire economic engine that had drawn most of these men into the wilderness in the first place, because it was in the water, in the beaver ponds and slow-moving creeks scattered across nearly every mountain valley, that a trapper found the animal upon which his entire livelihood depended. A stream was never simply a source of drinking water to a mountain man's practiced eye. It was also, quite possibly, a trap line waiting to be discovered, a series of ponds and lodges that might yield enough pelts across a single season to justify an entire year of hardship. This dual nature of water, essential for staying alive and essential for making a living, meant that a trapper's daily movements through the wilderness traced the paths of streams and rivers almost obsessively, following every promising creek back toward its source, noting every beaver dam and every fresh set of tracks along a muddy bank, because that same water that kept him alive through the night was also, if he read it correctly, quietly pointing the way toward the wealth he had come west to find. And once thirst was answered and a trap line set, there remained only the last and perhaps most demanding challenge of daily frontier life, the one that occupied more waking hours than almost any other. Somewhere out there in the timber, the grass, and the running water, a man still had to find enough to eat. Hunger, in the wilderness, was never far away, and every mountain man carried within him an intimate, practical understanding of the difference between simply finding food and finding enough food, consistently, to sustain the enormous physical demands of a life spent almost entirely outdoors. A trapper, working a line through rough country, might walk 15 or 20 miles in a single day, wading through freezing streams to check beaver sets, hauling firewood, building shelter, all of it in country where the nearest reliable meal might be a day's travel away or might not exist at all if the hunting had been poor that week. This was not a life that allowed for careless eating habits or wasted opportunities. Every encounter with a game trail, every rustle in the brush, every set of fresh tracks in soft mud demanded a trapper's full and immediate attention, because the difference between a full belly through a hard winter and a slow, grinding starvation often came down to how well he read those small signs day after day. The rifle was, without question, the centerpiece of a mountain man's food supply, and the animals of the Rocky Mountain region offered a genuine abundance to those skilled enough to take advantage of it. Elk moved through high mountain meadows in numbers that would astonish a modern hunter, their meat providing enormous quantities of protein from a single successful shot. Deer were common across nearly every elevation and habitat a trapper was likely to pass through. Buffalo, when a man was fortunate enough to find himself on the plains or in the foothill country where great herds still roamed, offered an almost unbelievable quantity of meat, fat, and hide from a single animal, enough in some cases to sustain an entire small party for weeks if the meat could be properly preserved before it spoiled. Successful hunting, though, demanded more than simply owning a good rifle. It demanded patience, an intimate knowledge of animal behavior and movement patterns through different seasons, an understanding of wind direction and how easily a careless approach could send an entire herd scattering before a shot was ever fired, and no small amount of simple physical endurance, since a large animal taken far from camp then had to be field-dressed and the meat hauled back, often across considerable and difficult distances. Trapping, meanwhile, was the quieter, more patient cousin of hunting, and it was trapping, specifically the trapping of beaver, that had drawn most of these men into the mountains in the first place. Beaver were creatures of habit, and a trapper who studied a pond carefully, noting the paths the animals used to enter and leave the water, the location of scent mounds where beaver marked their territory, could set his traps with real precision rather than blind hope. A steel trap, baited with a small amount of castoreum, a scent gland secretion taken from beaver themselves and placed carefully at the water's edge, could yield a pelt almost every single night if a trap line was well chosen and well maintained. This was demanding, unglamorous work, requiring a man to wade into frigid mountain water at dawn and again at dusk, checking each set along a line that might stretch for miles, resetting traps, and carrying home the catch to be skinned and the hide carefully prepared. But it was this quiet, repetitive labour, far more than any dramatic encounter with danger, that actually filled the days and the pack animals of most mountain men across an ordinary season. Fishing supplemented the diet wherever streams and lakes allowed for it, using simple lines, hooks, fashioned from bone or trade goods, and sometimes woven traps set across narrow channels to catch fish moving upstream. Trout, abundant in the clear, cold waters of the high country, provided a welcome and relatively easy source of protein on days when larger game proved elusive, requiring far less effort and risk than pursuing an elk or a buffalo, and a man skilled with a simple line could often catch enough for a meal within an hour beside a promising pool. Foraging rounded out the mountain man's diet, and here again, much of the essential knowledge had come directly from native peoples who had spent countless generations learning exactly which plants of this specific landscape offered nourishment and which carried real danger. Wild berries appeared in their proper season across mountain meadows and along stream banks, providing not only welcome variety, but genuinely valuable nutrients that a diet composed almost entirely of meat could otherwise lack. Certain roots, once properly identified and prepared, offered a starchy, calorie-dense supplement that could be dug and carried for later use. Wild onions, certain edible greens, and other plants scattered across the landscape rounded out a diet that, while heavily weighted toward meat, was rarely as narrow or as nutritionally poor as popular imagination sometimes suggests. A trapper who had learned this plant knowledge well, usually through direct contact and genuine relationship with native guides, trading partners, or in some cases a native wife, carried within his own memory an entire seasonal calendar of the landscape, knowing precisely where and when to look for a particular berry, a particular root, a particular green shoot pushing up through the last of the spring snow. None of this abundance, though, solved the single greatest food challenge of frontier life, which was not finding meat in the moment, but making that meat last. A single successful buffalo hunt might produce more food than 2 or 3 men could possibly eat before it spoiled, and a lean stretch of poor hunting weather later in the season could just as easily leave a man with nothing at all. Preservation then became one of the most essential skills a mountain man ever learned, and the primary method available to him was one borrowed again, largely from native practice: jerking, the slow drying of thin strips of meat, sometimes over a low, smoky fire, and sometimes simply in the dry mountain air and sun, until the moisture was drawn out almost entirely and the meat itself was transformed into something that would keep, edible and nourishing, for weeks or even months without spoiling. Smoking accomplished something similar, using the preserving properties of wood smoke alongside gentle heat to draw out moisture while also adding flavour and an additional protective layer against spoilage. Pemmican, a dense, remarkably long-lasting mixture of dried, pounded meat, combined with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries, represented perhaps the most sophisticated preservation technique available to trappers of this era. A food dense enough in calories and durable enough in storage that a small quantity could sustain a man through days of hard travel when there was no time or opportunity to hunt at all. This constant rhythm, feast in the good seasons and careful rationing through the lean ones, defined the eating pattern of nearly every mountain man who spent real time in the wilderness. A successful autumn hunt might leave a man's winter camp hung heavy with drying meat, a genuine abundance that would have seemed extraordinary to the average town dweller back east. But that same man, come the deep cold and short days of February, when game grew scarce and difficult to track through heavy snow, might find himself rationing carefully, stretching what remained of his dried supplies, supplementing with whatever small game or fish he could still manage to take, watching his own body lean down as the winter wore on toward spring. It was, in every sense, a life lived in close and constant negotiation with the natural rhythms of the land itself, a life that demanded not just physical skill with a rifle or a trap, but a deep, patient, hard-won understanding of when the wilderness was generous and when it was not, and the wisdom to prepare always for whichever season came next. Beyond the rifle, the knife, and the traps that formed the backbone of daily survival, a mountain man carried something less visible, but no less essential. A growing, ever-expanding library of practical knowledge, most of it held in his hands and his memory rather than in any book, and much of it borrowed, often gratefully, from people who had called this land home for far longer than any trapper had walked it. The wilderness did not reward strength alone, or even courage alone. It rewarded competence, the accumulated skill of 1,000 small tasks done correctly, again and again, until they required no conscious thought at all. And of every skill a trapper needed to master, none mattered more, day in and day out, than the simple, constant maintenance of the tools that kept him alive. The rifle came first in every accounting of a mountain man's equipment, and it demanded a level of care that bordered on reverence. In an era before waterproof coatings and modern steel, a rifle left damp overnight could rust along its barrel and lock within days, and a rusted lock could mean a misfire at exactly the wrong moment, whether facing down a charging animal or simply trying to bring home the evening's meal. Every trapper developed his own quiet ritual around his weapon, wiping the barrel dry after any exposure to rain or river crossing, keeping the lock mechanism lightly oiled with rendered animal fat when no proper gun oil was available, storing powder in a horn sealed carefully against moisture, because wet powder was useless powder, and useless powder in this country could very easily mean the difference between eating and not eating, or worse. A trapper learned to know his own rifle intimately, its particular quirks, how it shot a little high at long range or pulled slightly to one side, knowledge gathered through hundreds of shots fired across countless days until the weapon became almost an extension of his own body, responding to his hands with a familiarity that no borrowed rifle could ever quite match. The knife, meanwhile, though less glamorous than the rifle in the old stories, was arguably used far more often across the course of an ordinary day, and keeping its edge sharp was a task that never truly ended. A dull knife was not merely inconvenient, it was genuinely dangerous, since a blade that would not cut cleanly through hide or rope required far more pressure to use, and pressure applied to a slipping blade was how a man lost fingers, or worse, alone in country where the nearest help might be weeks away. A small, sharpening stone carried always became one of the most quietly essential pieces of a trapper's kit, and the rhythmic sound of steel drawn across stone, repeated in some quiet moment beside the evening fire, was as much a part of frontier life as the crack of a rifle or the crackle of burning pine. Trap setting, too, was a skill that separated the merely competent trapper from the truly successful one, and it rewarded patience and observation above almost anything else. A beaver trap set carelessly, in the wrong depth of water, or without properly masking the scent of human hands, might sit untouched for days, while a more thoughtfully placed set nearby filled steadily. Experienced trappers learned to read a beaver pond the way a scholar might read a familiar book, noting the location of lodges and dams, the paths worn smooth by repeated animal traffic entering and leaving the water, the precise placement that would put a trap directly in the path of a beaver's natural movement rather than hoping the animal might simply happen upon it. Scent played its own quiet role in this careful science, and a trapper carried castoreum not only as bait, but almost as a kind of currency, understanding exactly how much to use, exactly where to place it, exactly how the wind moving across a pond surface would carry that scent toward a beaver's keen senses. And once an animal was caught, whether beaver, deer, or elk, an entirely new set of skills came into play, because a hide left improperly handled would spoil within days, turning what should have been valuable currency into worthless, rotting waste. Hide tanning was slow, deliberate, often unpleasant work, involving the careful scraping away of remaining flesh and fat from the inner side of a skin, followed by a curing process that varied depending on the intended use of the finished hide, sometimes involving the animal's own brain matter worked carefully into the skin, a technique known as brain tanning, learned again almost entirely from native practice, that produced a remarkably soft, supple, and durable leather without any of the industrial chemicals a modern tannery would use. This was not quick work. A single hide might require days of careful attention, spread out, scraped, worked by hand until the fibers softened, and a trapper who wanted his own clothing repaired or replaced, since store-bought fabric back east was a luxury rarely available out here, needed to master this same slow process for himself, turning raw hide into usable leather for moccasins, leggings, or a new hunting shirt when the old one had finally worn through beyond any further mending. Clothing repair itself was a nightly or weekly ritual for nearly every trapper, since the wilderness was unforgiving toward fabric and leather alike. Brush tore at seams, river crossings soaked garments through, weakening stitching over time. A tear left unmended tonight became a larger tear tomorrow, and eventually a garment that no longer protected a man from cold or wet at all. Most trappers carried a small kit of sinew or thread and a bone or metal awl, and the quiet work of mending by firelight, patching a moccasin sole worn thin by miles of walking, or reinforcing a seam along a hunting shirt became one of the small, meditative tasks that punctuated the end of nearly every day in camp. Yet of all the knowledge a mountain man came to possess, none was more valuable or more humbly acquired than what he learned directly from the native peoples of the region, and this deserves honest, careful attention rather than the brief footnote it sometimes receives. The tribes of the Rocky Mountain West, from the Crow to the Shoshone to the Blackfeet and many others across this vast landscape, possessed a depth of practical knowledge about this specific country that no trapper, however skilled, could have developed on his own within a single lifetime, let alone within the handful of years most mountain men actually spent in the wilderness. They knew which plants could heal a wound and which could poison a careless forager. They knew the seasonal movements of game animals across enormous stretches of territory, knowledge built from countless generations of careful observation passed down through story and direct teaching. They knew how to move through winter country in ways that conserved energy and avoided danger, how to read weather signs in the sky and in animal behavior days before a storm actually arrived, how to build shelters suited precisely to this landscape and this climate, refined over centuries rather than years. The most successful mountain men were, almost without exception, the ones humble enough to recognize this expertise and eager enough to learn from it. Many formed genuine trading relationships and lasting friendships with native individuals and communities. Some married native women, unions that were, in a great many documented cases, marriages of real partnership and mutual benefit, bringing a trapper not only companionship in an isolating life, but also direct access to an entire body of practical wilderness knowledge that might otherwise have taken him decades to acquire through trial and error alone, if he survived that long at all. A native wife often knew intimately how to process a hide more efficiently, how to identify a wider range of edible and medicinal plants across the changing seasons, how to read the subtle signs of an approaching storm in the color of the evening sky or the behavior of birds and animals. This exchange of knowledge flowed in both directions, certainly, as trade goods, tools, and other items moved from trapper to tribe in return. But intellectually and practically, the debt ran heavily toward the newcomers, and the wisest trappers understood this plainly, without the false pride that sometimes clouds the old romantic version of frontier history. Survival, real survival, sustained across years rather than mere weeks, depended on this humility, on the willingness to set aside assumptions brought from the eastern towns and instead learn, patiently and respectfully, from those who already understood this land as home rather than as wilderness to be conquered. All of this knowledge, gathered from hard experience and generous teaching alike, existed for a single practical purpose: to keep a man alive and moving through a landscape that offered no roads, no signs, and no guarantee that the route he chose today would still be passable tomorrow. And once shelter was built, fire tended, water found, and food secured, there remained one final skill without which none of the others mattered very much at all. A trapper had to know with real confidence exactly where he was and exactly how to get to wherever he needed to go next. There were no road signs in this country, no mile markers, no printed maps reliable enough to trust with a man's life. The maps that did exist, drawn by the handful of earlier explorers and traders who had passed this way before, were often vague, incomplete, or simply wrong in ways that could prove genuinely dangerous to a trapper who trusted them too literally. Navigation in the Rocky Mountain wilderness was instead an intensely practical skill built almost entirely from direct observation, patient memory, and a deep, working familiarity with the land itself, developed over seasons and years of actually moving through it. The mountains and rivers of this country became, for an experienced trapper, something closer to a mental map than any drawing on paper could ever be. A particular peak, distinctive in its shape against the horizon, might serve as a reliable landmark, visible from 50 miles in any direction, a fixed point around which an entire mental geography of the surrounding country could be organized. Rivers offered perhaps the most reliable navigational tool of all, since water always flowed downhill and always eventually led somewhere useful toward a larger river, toward a valley a man might already know, toward country with more game and better shelter than the high, exposed ridgelines above. A trapper who found himself lost or uncertain of his location in unfamiliar country often oriented himself simply by finding the nearest running water and following it, trusting that the river itself would eventually lead him back toward familiar ground, or toward a landmark he could recognize. The stars, too, offered their own quiet, reliable guidance, particularly on clear mountain nights, when the sky opened up in a way rarely seen from the towns and cities back east, a dense, brilliant scatter of stars, unobscured by any artificial light. The North Star, once located, provided a fixed and unwavering point of reference, useful for maintaining a general sense of direction during night travel or simply for confirming before sleep which way camp was oriented relative to the route planned for the following day. Beyond the stars, an experienced trapper read countless smaller signs woven into the landscape itself. The way moss tended, though not with perfect reliability, to grow more thickly on the shaded, typically northern side of trees and rocks, the particular slant of sunlight at different times of day and different seasons of the year, the direction certain trees leaned in response to prevailing winds that blew consistently from one direction across a given valley or ridge. Perhaps most valuable of all, though, was simple memory, built and reinforced through repeated travel across the same general territory season after season. A trapper who had worked a particular valley for 2 or 3 years developed an intimate, almost instinctive familiarity with its geography, knowing without conscious thought which drainage led toward good beaver country and which dead-ended in an impassable canyon, which mountain pass remained open latest into the autumn before the first heavy snows arrived, and which route, though perhaps a few miles longer, avoided the steepest and most exhausting climbs. This kind of knowledge could not be taught quickly or transferred easily on paper. It accumulated slowly, mile by mile, season by season, until an experienced mountain man carried within his own mind a working map more detailed and more reliable than anything a professional cartographer of the era could have produced from the same territory. The seasonal rhythms of movement across this landscape followed patterns that were themselves a kind of navigation, guided as much by the behavior of game animals as by any fixed geographic landmark. Elk and deer moved to lower elevations as winter approached, seeking shelter from the deepest snow and easier access to remaining forage, and a trapper who understood this pattern followed the game downward as the season turned, both for continued hunting success and because the same lower elevations that suited the animals also offered him gentler terrain and more reliable shelter through the hardest months. Come spring, as snow retreated back up the mountainsides and fresh growth emerged first at lower elevations before climbing steadily higher through the following weeks, both game and trapper alike moved upward again, following the receding snow line into high country that had been impassable only months before. This annual migration upward in spring and summer, downward as autumn deepened into winter, structured the entire yearly rhythm of frontier life, a slow, patient dance with the mountains themselves that a trapper repeated, with small variations, for as many years as he chose to remain in this demanding and beautiful country. Yet for all this hard-won mastery, for all the accumulated skill in shelter and fire and food and navigation, the wilderness never fully surrendered its danger. A man could do everything correctly, every single day, for months on end, and still find himself facing a threat that no amount of skill or preparation could entirely eliminate. That reality, the constant, quiet presence of genuine danger, was woven through every single day of a mountain man's existence, and it deserves its own honest and careful telling. The dangers of this life took many forms, and an experienced trapper learned to hold an awareness of all of them simultaneously, without allowing that awareness to tip over into the kind of paralyzing fear that could itself become dangerous in country, demanding calm, clear thinking above almost everything else. Wildlife posed one of the most immediate and unpredictable threats, and none loomed larger in both reality and legend than the grizzly bear, an animal that shared this mountain country in genuine abundance during the era of the fur trade, and one that showed little inclination to retreat from a human encounter the way smaller black bears more commonly did. A grizzly, standing sometimes 8 feet tall on its hind legs and possessed of a strength that could tear apart a fallen log in search of grubs as easily as a man might open a book, was an animal that demanded constant, careful respect. Trappers learned to read the signs of grisly presence, fresh tracks pressed deep into soft mud, claw marks raked high into the bark of a tree, and to adjust their movements accordingly, making noise while moving through dense brush or along stream banks where visibility was limited, giving any nearby bear ample warning and, ideally, the opportunity to move away before any direct encounter became necessary. Wolves, too, moved through this country in numbers difficult to imagine today, and while they rarely posed the same direct threat to an armed and alert man that a surprised grizzly might, a pack of wolves following a wounded animal or growing bold during a particularly hard winter when game grew scarce was never something to be dismissed lightly. Mountain lions, solitary and rarely seen even by experienced trappers who spent years in their territory, presented a quieter, more unpredictable danger, capable of taking down prey far larger than themselves with a single, silent, well-placed attack from cover. Beyond the animals themselves, the environment offered its own array of dangers, often more statistically deadly across the full span of the fur trade era than any single encounter with a bear or wolf ever proved to be. Extreme cold could kill a man in a matter of hours if he found himself caught unprepared, far from shelter, during an unexpected mountain storm, temperatures dropping with a suddenness that could catch even experienced trappers off guard when a clear morning gave no warning of the blizzard building unseen beyond a distant ridge. Avalanches threaten travel through steep winter country, a genuine and largely unpredictable danger in terrain where heavy snow accumulated on slopes throughout an entire season, waiting only for the right combination of weight, temperature, and vibration to release without warning. Flash floods, sudden and often nearly silent until the moment they arrived, could transform a peaceful, shallow stream into a raging torrent within minutes if a storm broke somewhere upriver, entirely out of sight and hearing of a man camped in what had seemed, only hours before, like perfectly safe and dry ground. And, perhaps most dangerous of all, in the simple, unglamorous accounting of frontier mortality, was injury itself. A broken leg from a fall on loose rock, a deep cut from a careless moment with a skinning knife, an infected wound that might have been minor and easily treated back in any settled town, all became genuinely life-threatening in a country where the nearest help, if it existed at all, might lie a week's hard travel away. There was, too, the ever-present possibility of conflict, whether with rival trapping parties competing fiercely over the same increasingly scarce beaver populations as the fur trade matured and expanded through the decades, or, in certain times and certain places, with native groups whose relationship to the growing presence of trappers on their traditional lands ranged enormously across the full spectrum from welcoming trade partnership to understandable and often justified hostility, particularly as encroachment increased and resources grew strained in various regions over time. This was a complicated and often painful history, one that resists easy or comfortable summary, and honest tellings of this era acknowledge that danger sometimes flowed in both directions, born from genuine grievance as often as from simple misunderstanding. Yet perhaps the deepest and most constant danger of all, the one that underlay every other threat and gave each of them their particular weight, was simply isolation itself. A trapper who fell seriously ill or suffered a serious injury while working a trap line alone, far from any companion, faced his crisis with no one to help him, no one even to know that help was needed at all. A twisted ankle that would be a minor inconvenience back in any settled town, easily treated and quickly healed, could become, in this country, a genuine death sentence if it left a man unable to walk back to camp, unable to hunt, unable to reach water, with no one aware of his location or his need. This particular danger rarely announced itself with the drama of a charging grizzly or the sudden violence of a flash flood. It simply existed, quietly, as an unbroken undercurrent beneath every single day a man spent alone in this vast country, a constant, sober awareness that there was no safety net beneath him, no one coming to check on him if days passed without word, nothing standing between him and whatever the wilderness might decide to test him with except his own accumulated skill, his own careful judgment, and, when all else failed, simple, stubborn luck. And it was precisely this constant undercurrent of danger and isolation, carried quietly through every ordinary day of shelter building and fire tending and hunting and careful navigation, that shaped something deeper and more interior in the men who lived this life for any real length of time, something beyond mere physical survival. Because a man does not spend months alone in vast, silent country without that solitude reaching down into him and changing something fundamental about how he understood himself, and it is to that quiet, interior landscape, every bit as real as the mountains themselves, that we turn next. There is a particular quality to silence that a man only comes to know after he has lived inside it for weeks at a stretch, and it is unlike any silence available within the walls of a town or a settled home. It is not the absence of sound so much as the presence of an entirely different kind of listening, one where the smallest noises, a branch settling under snow, water moving somewhere beneath river ice, the distant call of an elk on a cold morning, arrive with a clarity and weight that a crowded, noisy world back east could never have prepared a man to notice. Solitude, for the mountain man, was not simply a circumstance of his chosen life. It became, over time, something closer to a companion in its own right, and learning to live well within it was every bit as important a survival skill as building a shelter or striking a fire, though it left no visible mark upon the landscape and earned no mention in the old company ledgers that recorded only furs and dollars. The psychological texture of this solitude shifted gradually across a season in ways that a man rarely noticed while he was living through them, only recognizing the change when he looked back later from the safety of a rendezvous or a winter camp shared with a few trusted companions. In the first days alone, the mind remained busy with the noise of the world left behind, replaying conversations, worrying over unfinished business, filling the silence with a kind of internal chatter that mirrored the constant low hum of town life. But as days stretched into weeks, something in that internal noise began, slowly, to quiet. The mind, finding nothing new to chew on from the world it had left behind, began instead to settle into the present moment in a way that few people in any era, before or since, have had the chance to experience so completely. A trapper alone on a high trap line in October might find himself thinking of almost nothing at all for long stretches of an afternoon, simply moving, watching, listening, present in his body and his immediate surroundings with a totality that modern minds, cluttered with constant distraction, would likely find almost impossible to sustain even for a single hour. This was not, it should be said clearly, an easy or uniformly pleasant experience. Loneliness, real and sometimes sharp, visited every man who chose this life, and the old journals and later recollections of trappers who lived to tell their stories speak honestly, when they speak of it at all, of nights when the isolation weighed heavily, when a man found himself talking aloud to his horse or to the fire simply to hear a human voice, his own, break the enormous quiet pressing in from every direction. There were nights when the absence of any other soul for 100 miles in any direction felt less like freedom and more like a kind of exile, and a trapper in this state learned of necessity to manage his own mind the way he managed his fire or his food supply, with deliberate attention and a kind of hard-won discipline. He learned which thoughts to indulge and which to set firmly aside before they could spiral into something darker. He learned to find genuine comfort in small, repeated rituals, the particular way he laid out his gear each evening, the familiar weight of his rifle across his knees as he sat by the fire, small anchors of routine that gave shape and steadiness to days that might otherwise have felt shapeless and endless. And yet, for many of these men, and this is a truth the old romantic legends sometimes obscure beneath their tales of danger and adventure, solitude eventually became something closer to a genuine preference than a burden merely endured. There is ample evidence, scattered through the letters and later reminiscences of men who spent years in this life, that many mountain men came to find something in extended solitude that they could locate nowhere else, a clarity of mind, a settled sense of self, a freedom from the constant, low-grade friction of other people's expectations and judgments that most human beings live with every day of their lives without even fully noticing the weight of it. Self-reliance, for these men, became not merely a practical necessity, but a genuine source of identity and quiet pride. A man who had built his own shelter, tended his own fire, hunted his own food, and navigated hundreds of miles of unmapped wilderness relying on nothing but his own two hands and his own accumulated knowledge, carried within himself a particular kind of confidence that few people in any era have had the opportunity to earn so completely and so thoroughly. This was not arrogance in most cases, but something quieter and steadier, a settled certainty in his own capability that asked for no outside validation because it had already been proven repeatedly against the hardest and most honest judge available. The wilderness itself, which offered no false praise and no comforting lies, only the plain, unforgiving fact of whether a man had done the work correctly or not. The quiet routines of solitary camp life, small and repetitive as they were, took on an almost meditative weight in this context, becoming far more than mere chores. The careful mending of a torn moccasin by firelight, done slowly and without any pressing need to hurry, became a small act of care extended toward oneself in a place where no one else would ever extend it on his behalf. The methodical cleaning and oiling of a rifle, repeated with the same careful sequence of movements evening after evening, became a kind of ritual, as much as a practical necessity, a way of marking the transition from the labor of the day into the rest of the evening. For the small number of trappers who carried the ability to read and write and who had access to paper and ink, however limited, journal keeping became a way of holding on to some thread of connection to the wider world and to their own inner life, brief entries noting the weather, the day's catch, the condition of the horses, occasionally something closer to genuine reflection on the strange, solitary beauty of the life they had chosen. These journals, where they survive at all, offer some of the only direct windows historians now have into the interior experience of this life, brief, plainly written lines that nonetheless carry within them the full weight of what it meant to sit alone beside a fire in October, watching the last light fade from a ridge no other white man might ever have seen, and to feel, in that moment, something closer to peace than to fear. Observation of the natural world, too, became a genuine and often deeply absorbing pastime for men who had nowhere else to direct their attention. A trapper spending weeks in one general area came to know the particular habits of the animals sharing that landscape, with an intimacy that bordered on genuine friendship, recognizing individual elk by small distinguishing marks, learning the particular calling patterns of birds through different hours of the day and different seasons of the year, noticing the small, gradual changes in the landscape itself as autumn deepened into winter, or as the first green shoots of spring pushed up through the last patches of melting snow. This was not idle curiosity, but something that grew in many men into a genuine and abiding attachment to the specific places they had come to know so thoroughly, an attachment that outlasted, in many recorded cases, the trapping career itself, drawing men back to particular valleys and particular mountains again and again across years, not merely for the beaver that might still be found there, but for something less easily named, a sense of belonging to a landscape that had, in its own quiet way, become as familiar and as dear as any home a man might have left behind. It would be a mistake, though, To imagine this solitary life as one of unbroken isolation stretching endlessly across every season without relief, because even the most independent free trapper understood that some measure of human connection remained essential, not merely for practical reasons of trade and resupply, but for something deeper in the human spirit that solitude alone, however well managed, could never fully satisfy. And it was for exactly this reason that the yearly rendezvous came to occupy such an outsized place in the memory and imagination of every man who lived this life, a single bright thread of human company woven once each year through an otherwise unbroken fabric of solitude. And it is to that remarkable gathering, and to what it meant, to the men who spent the other 11 months of their year almost entirely alone, that we turn next. Once each year, usually as summer settled over the mountains and the previous winters furs had been carefully bundled and packed for travel, something happened in the Rocky Mountain wilderness that had no real equivalent anywhere else in American life during this era. Trappers scattered across hundreds of miles of remote country, men who might not have seen another human face in months, began converging from every direction on a single predetermined valley, drawn by an appointment made a full year in advance and honored with a reliability that seems almost remarkable, given how little formal communication existed to enforce it. This was the rendezvous, and for the relatively brief span of years during which this particular system operated, it stood as the one great bridge connecting the isolated world of the mountain trapper back to the wider currents of trade, company, and simple human companionship. The practical purpose of the rendezvous was straightforward enough on its surface. Fur companies, recognizing that the old system of building and maintaining permanent trading posts deep in dangerous and remote country was both expensive and inefficient, developed instead a system of sending supply caravans out from the settlements each year to a designated meeting point, where trappers could sell their accumulated furs directly, resupply on powder, lead, traps, and other essential goods, and then disperse once again into the mountains to begin the cycle anew. For the companies, this represented sound and profitable business practice. For the trappers themselves, though, the rendezvous meant something that went far beyond simple commerce, and the old accounts of these gatherings, when they survive at all, describe scenes of celebration so intense and so prolonged that they seem almost to belong to a different category of experience altogether from the quiet, disciplined solitude that had defined the preceding 11 months. Imagine, for a moment, what this gathering must have felt like to a man who had spent the better part of a year working largely alone, his conversations limited perhaps to occasional brief exchanges with other small parties encountered by chance along a trap line, his evenings spent in silence broken only by the crackle of his own fire. And then, cresting a ridge or rounding a bend in a familiar valley, he would see it. An entire temporary town of tents and lodges spread across the meadow below, smoke rising from dozens of fires rather than his own single small one. The sound, carrying clearly across the summer air, of human voices, laughter, singing, the particular chaos of hundreds of people gathered together after long isolation, trappers and company men and native traders, and in many cases, entire native families who came to trade alongside the mountain men, all converging on this single valley for a few precious weeks of the year. The sensory shock of this transition from the profound quiet of solitary wilderness life to the sudden, overwhelming abundance of human company must have been genuinely disorienting And the old accounts suggest that many trappers spent the first day or two of a rendezvous in a kind of happy daze, simply absorbing the sheer, unfamiliar richness of so many voices at once. The business of the rendezvous, the actual trading of furs for supplies and cash, occupied only a portion of the gathering's energy, and often not even the largest portion. What the old accounts dwell on at greater length, and what clearly lived largest in the memory of the men who attended these gatherings, was everything else that happened once the practical business of trade had been concluded. There was drinking, often heavy and prolonged, as trappers who had gone without spirits for the better part of a year made up for lost time with an enthusiasm that the company traders, who marked up their liquor prices considerably for exactly this occasion, were only too happy to profit from. There were contests of every kind, feats of marksmanship that tested a trapper's rifle skills against his fellow mountain men in friendly but genuinely fierce competition, wrestling matches, horse races. Across the open meadow, foot races, and countless smaller wagers and challenges that filled the long summer days with noise and laughter, and the particular camaraderie that grows between men who have each independently survived something genuinely difficult and dangerous, and who recognize in each other a shared understanding that no one back in the settled towns could ever quite grasp in the same way. There was storytelling too, an entire oral tradition of tall tales and genuine adventure recounted around shared fires late into the long summer evenings. Stories that grew, no doubt, somewhat larger and more dramatic with each retelling, embellished and polished across successive rendezvous gatherings until fact and legend had woven together into something that was, perhaps, more true to the spirit of the life than any strictly accurate account could have been. These stories served a genuine purpose beyond mere entertainment. They were how news travelled through this scattered community, word of which valleys still held good beaver populations and which had been trapped out, word of which passes remained dangerous with hostile encounters and which had grown safer, word of distant events back in the settled world that filtered slowly westward and arrived, months late, carried by the company traders who had come out from the towns. For men who spent most of their year cut off from any reliable source of news, the rendezvous functioned as a kind of annual newspaper, delivered not in print, but in the accumulated voices of hundreds of men and women who had each carried their own small piece of the wider world into this single gathered valley. And beneath all of this celebration and commerce and storytelling lay something quieter, and perhaps more essential still, the simple, profound relief of remembered human connection after months of enforced solitude. Old friendships formed in previous years or even previous decades of shared trapping seasons were renewed with genuine warmth. New friendships formed quickly in the particular way that happens between people who share a rare and demanding common experience, a mutual recognition that required no lengthy explanation, because each man understood, without needing to be told, exactly what the other had endured and exactly what he had gained from enduring it. For those trappers who had married into native communities, the rendezvous often meant reunion with wives and children who might have remained with extended family through the trapping season, a return to the warmth of domestic life, however briefly, before the demands of the coming season pulled a man back into the mountains once again. Yet even in the midst of all of this celebration, the rendezvous carried within it an unmistakable awareness of its own temporary nature, a kind of bittersweet undertone that ran beneath even the most joyful moments of the gathering. Every man there understood, from the very first day, that this abundance of company was borrowed time, that within a matter of weeks the tents would come down, the supplies would be packed onto horses and mules, and the entire temporary town would disperse once again into the vast surrounding wilderness, each man or small party heading back out toward whatever stretch of mountain country they had chosen to work for the coming season. This knowledge seemed, if anything, to intensify, rather than diminish the joy of the gathering while it lasted, lending the whole affair a quality of concentrated, deliberate savouring that a more casual or permanent form of community might never have developed. Men who knew they would soon return to months of solitude drank deeper, laughed longer, and held their conversations a little more closely, aware in some unspoken way of exactly how precious and how fleeting this particular kind of company truly was. As the rendezvous drew to its close and the great temporary gathering began, once again, to scatter back into the mountains from which it had briefly emerged, each trapper carried with him something more than fresh supplies and a renewed store of powder and lead. He carried, too, a kind of quiet reassurance, however briefly renewed, that he remained part of something larger than his own solitary existence, a scattered community of men who understood, without needing explanation, exactly what this particular life demanded and exactly what it offered in return. And it is with this understanding, this sense of a life lived deliberately at the edge of the known world, sustained by hard-won skill and occasional treasured company, that we come, at last, to consider what all of it amounted to, what the mountain man's brief and remarkable era ultimately left behind, both in the physical landscape he moved through and in the wider memory of the country that came, eventually, to follow the trails he had first opened. The era of the mountain man was, in the broader sweep of American history, remarkably brief, lasting in its purest form for perhaps only 2 or 3 decades, before changing fashions in Europe reduced demand for beaver felt, before the beaver populations themselves grew thin from years of intensive trapping, and before the wagon trains and eventually the railroads began carrying an entirely different kind of traveller west, one seeking not solitary wilderness but settled farmland, established towns, and the comforts of the very civilization the mountain men had so deliberately left behind. And yet, for all its brevity, this era left a mark on the American landscape and the American imagination that has proven remarkably durable, one that continues to shape how this country understands its own relationship to wild, untamed land, even now, generations after the last free trapper hung up his traps for the final time. The most immediate and practical legacy of the mountain men lay simply in the knowledge they accumulated and carried with them, knowledge that proved essential to nearly everything that followed in the settlement of the American West. The routes these trappers discovered and refined through years of patient, careful travel, the mountain passes they identified as viable for larger parties, the river crossings they learned to navigate safely, the general geography of a region that had, before their arrival, existed as little more than blank and uncertain space on any map available to the wider American public, all of this hard-won knowledge became the foundation upon which later westward expansion was built. When the great wagon trains began rolling west in subsequent decades, carrying entire families toward new lives in Oregon and California, they followed trails first identified and proven passable by mountain men working alone or in small parties years earlier, men like Jedediah Smith, whose extensive travels through country no other American had yet seen provided crucial early knowledge of routes and terrain that would later carry thousands of settlers safely across the same forbidding landscape. In this very direct and practical sense, the solitary work of a relatively small number of trappers, undertaken originally for entirely commercial reasons, having nothing to do with future settlement, quietly laid essential groundwork for the much larger movement of people that followed. But the legacy of the mountain man extends well beyond mere practical geography into something less tangible and, in certain ways, more significant to how this particular period of history has been remembered and understood. These men came to represent, in the American imagination, a particular vision of independence and self-reliance that has proven remarkably persistent, resurfacing again and again across successive generations in literature, in art, in the stories a country tells itself about its own character and its own relationship to the natural world. The image of a single man, entirely self-sufficient, capable of surviving and even thriving in the harshest and most remote wilderness through nothing more than his own skill, knowledge, and determination, became a kind of foundational American archetype, one that has echoed forward through countless later figures in American culture, however imperfectly or romantically those later figures may have understood the actual, difficult, unglamorous reality of the life that first inspired them. It is worth pausing here, though, to hold this legacy with the same honesty and care that has run through our entire journey together tonight, because the story of the mountain man, like so much of American frontier history, carries within it genuine complexity that deserves acknowledgement rather than simple, uncomplicated celebration. The fur trade that drew these men west was built in significant part on the near-catastrophic depletion of beaver populations across enormous stretches of the continent, an early and largely unregulated example of resource extraction whose long-term ecological consequences the trappers of this era had little reason or ability to consider. The relationship between mountain men and native peoples, while often marked by genuine friendship, mutual respect, and essential knowledge exchange, existed within a much larger and more troubled historical context of encroachment, displacement, and conflict that would only intensify in the decades following the mountain man era as the trails these trappers had discovered carried, eventually, the much larger and more permanent wave of settlement that would prove so devastating to the native nations whose land this had always rightfully been. An honest telling of this history holds both truths together: the genuine skill, courage, and hard-won wisdom of individual men living an extraordinarily demanding life, and the larger, more troubling historical currents that their individual choices, however personally admirable, were nonetheless quietly serving. What remains most striking, though, when we set aside the larger historical currents and return our attention to the individual, daily texture of this life, the shelter built by patient hands against a cold mountain evening, the fire tended carefully through a long winter night, the quiet satisfaction of a well-set trap line checked at dawn, the rare and treasured company of a rendezvous gathering after months of solitude, is simply the sheer, sustained competence these men developed, the depth and breadth of practical skill required to remain alive and reasonably content in country that offered no safety net whatsoever beyond a man's own accumulated knowledge and steady judgment. This was not a life of constant dramatic adventure, whatever the old romanticized stories might suggest. It was far more often a life of patient, repeated, careful attention to countless small and unglamorous tasks, the daily maintenance of shelter and fire and food supply, the constant, quiet vigilance required to notice danger before it became crisis, the slow accumulation, season after season, of a knowledge so thorough and so deeply internalized that it eventually required no conscious thought at all, becoming instead something closer to instinct, a fluency with wild country that few human beings in any era before or since have had the opportunity or the necessity to develop so completely. And perhaps this, more than any single dramatic story of danger survived or fortune won, is the truest legacy worth carrying forward from this brief and remarkable chapter of American history, a quiet reminder of what human beings are actually capable of when circumstance demands it, how much can be learned, how much resilience can be developed, how deeper peace can eventually be found even in profound isolation when a person commits fully to understanding and working patiently with the natural world rather than against it. The wilderness that these men moved through, that tested them relentlessly and taught them, slowly and without mercy, exactly what they needed to know in order to survive within it, has largely passed now into a different kind of existence, mapped, measured, and made accessible in ways the mountain men themselves could scarcely have imagined. But the mountains themselves remain largely unchanged in their essential character, still capable of the same beauty and the same danger that shaped the lives of the men who once called them home for a season, or for a decade, or for the whole of a life deliberately chosen and quietly, thoroughly lived. As we come now to the close of tonight's journey together, let your mind rest for a moment on the image of a single small fire burning steadily in a vast, dark landscape somewhere in the folded mountains of a country that no longer exists, quite as it did then, tended by a man who asked for nothing from the world beyond what his own two hands and his own patient, hard-won knowledge could provide. He is not thinking in this quiet moment of legacy or history or the larger currents of a nation moving slowly westward around him. He is thinking, perhaps, of very little at all, simply present in the particular stillness of a mountain evening, the fire warm against the growing cold, the rifle close at hand, the stars beginning to emerge overhead in a sky unmarked by any light but their own. Tomorrow will bring its own demands, its own small tasks of survival patiently attended to, but tonight, for this one quiet hour, there is only the fire and the silence and the deep, settled peace of a man entirely at home in a wilderness that has, through hard seasons and patient learning, finally stopped feeling like a threat and become instead, simply and completely, his own. Let that same quiet settle now over you wherever you are listening from. Whatever fire or lamp or soft glow of a screen is the last thing your eyes will register before sleep finally comes. You are safe, you are warm, and somewhere in the folded mountains of memory and imagination, that fire is still burning, low and steady, keeping watch through the night, so that you don't have to. Sleep well.